Hello and welcome to The Big Rishi, the podcast where we're tracking the first 100 days of Rishi Sunak's premiership and just seeing what he gets up to. As always, I'm joined by Ben Blissett.
Hello.
And Rory Taylor.
Hello.
I normally say what you do, but I forgot today. They know
by
now.
us.
If they're this deep, huge names in media.
Yeah.
How don't you know? Massive scoops getting you two. How are we both doing?
Don't like we've started this with such a dick.
I know.
I was doing good until that insult, to be honest.
I'm still doing good, to be honest. Still doing good, yeah.
Well.
Pretty good.
Do you want to explain what's going on here?
We're not just having beers because we wanted beers.
Oh,
it's
no,
actually...
we're not.
Oh, well, there you go.
Maybe both.
I am.
It's
Rory
actually
isn't.
we're toasting Rishi Sunak for surpassing Liz Truss in number of days as Prime Minister. So, well done.
Big namaste.
Cheers, Rishi.
Cheers, Rishi.
So he's on, I believe, 51 days now.
Yeah.
Liz Truss was 49 in the end.
He smoked her.
So he's no longer the shortest serving, or he definitely won't be the shortest serving Prime Minister.
Oh, from by height. Ooh.
Yeah.
I'm joking. He's not that short.
Yeah, very good.
We like short people.
So yeah, big moment for the podcast. Big moment for Rishi. Well done, Rishi.
Well done.
Oh, I'm sure it would mean a lot to him. He's a big fan.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, just to be clear, it's not a huge achievement.
No, 51 days.
No.
Most prime ministers have done that.
Yes.
Um,
Well,
Really?
every single Prime
Yeah,
Minister.
apart from one.
Apart from one.
yeah.
It's about 100 more days until he's not the second shortest serving.
Who was?
George Canning.
Very good.
We won't be
Yes.
here for that though. We're only doing the first 100.
But the
Yeah.
only reason George Canning was that short is actually because he died in office.
Why did you said that in a way that made me laugh? And
I don't know. It just
don't
sounded
want
like
it on
an
record.
audio book.
Do you know who the
Yeah.
shortest serving Prime Minister who left office without dying was?
Was it Viscount?
Okay,
Goderich?
so there's a
Yeah.
lot of
Thank you,
strikes
Goderich.
going on this month. We've covered it a couple of times before. We covered it on the channel.
Yeah.
We've done shorts, all kinds of stuff. So, who's striking and what are they striking about?
So there's a load of different groups. I don't like that you interrupted my Viscount Goderich fan. I just don't want that to go unnoticed.
I'll do it again if you mention that man's
The
name
audience
again.
loves it. Let us know in the
You should
comments how
mute
much
the
you like
mic,
our Lord
mute the
Goderich
mic.
fact.
You should say who isn't striking because it's
Yeah.
Whoa.
loads of people are.
So
Satire,
we've got-
right?
Very good. We've got rail workers, NHS workers, Royal Mail, members of the civil service. All of those are striking this month. It's basically disputes over pay because they're often being given pay rises which are below inflation, which means that they're all having to accept real-term pay cuts.
Yes.
So they're all sort of making demands to try and increase their pay to make sure that they basically stay at the same rate.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's why the strikes are happening.
Of those people, though, the strikes that are most readily discussed in the media are nurses and the RMT, that's the rail union. So what are those specific strikes actually about? What are they looking for?
So the Royal College of Nursing has asked for a 5% pay increase above inflation.
Wow.
So that will obviously, what they're asking for will change as inflation changes.
Yeah.
So by some estimates, the upper end estimates are estimating that inflation is currently about 14%,
Okay.
which means the government are kind of using this 19% figure as almost like an insult to try and say,
Sure.
you know,
It's
they're asking for 19%, this is too high. So 19% is the figure the government are claiming that the Royal College of Nursing
Yeah.
are asking for. What they're actually asking for is 5% above inflation, which when they made the claim wouldn't have been
Anywhere near as much.
19%. But
Got
because this dispute has lasted so long,
Yeah.
it's about 19%. Interestingly, just staying on the Royal College of Nursing, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party has actually said that that is too high, that they don't think the government can afford that.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're still criticising the government and criticising them for not
Why wouldn't they? It's their job.
coming to an agreement with the Royal College of
Yeah.
Nursing. But interestingly, even Labour accept that that's too high.
And presumably the inflation plus 5, the justification I'm guessing is the historic underpayment and the fact wages haven't kept
Yeah.
track with what inflation
Yeah.
for
It's
a while
basically
now.
to keep up with inflation this year, but also the last 10 years of not being paid in line with inflation.
Fair enough. The RMT, what's the
Exactly.
case there?
So the RMT, they, to my
This is
knowledge,
complicated, right?
No, it's slightly more complicated. To my knowledge, they haven't got something that they're specifically asking for because there's
Okay.
a lot of other factors at play here. A lot of the dispute between the RMT and Network Rail and other operating companies are effectively not only to do with pay, they're to do with working conditions as well.
Sure.
So it's not as simple as just saying that they're looking for a certain percentage pay rise
Yeah.
because there's a lot of other things to do with what days they work, unsociable hours. There's stuff to do with technology. So there's this whole dispute about these, like, when doors close on trains, they can be automated, but the RMT is saying that they won't accept that being rolled out because they don't think it can be done in a safe way. It also means that certain workers would be laid off for doing that. So there's a huge amount of things that are actually at play with the RMT dispute. But in effect, the latest offer from Network Rail is a 5% pay rise this year and a further 4% pay rise at the beginning of next year.
Okay.
They claim that they will not make there be any compulsory job losses until January 25. The issue is, though, that this deal also comes, so this deal came from Network Rail to the RMT. It also comes with an increase in unsociable hours, so 30% increase in unsociable hours. It also comes with a 50% cut in scheduled maintenance work.
Wow.
So there's a lot of things involved in this, but in essence, they're just, if you want to boil it down to its simplest thing, they're only being offered 5% this year, 4% next year. Inflation's in excess of 10%.
Yeah.
That's not a huge pay rise.
Especially considering the other factors they care about aren't being addressed.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Things like working conditions, maintenance, all those things actually getting worse.
They also balloted their members to see whether they would accept this deal proposed to them by Network Rail.
Yeah.
The RMT advised their members not to vote against it. 64% of their members voted against it.
Closer than you might expect, though.
Yeah. Obviously, striking means that people won't be paid for the days that they're striking.
Yes, so it's understandable that some people just want it done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's coming up to Christmas. It's a cost of living crisis. So some people might be voting against on those grounds. That was rejected. There's been some disagreement as well about the government's role in all of this, because largely the RMT is negotiating with companies like Network Rail. The government hasn't really been involved that much. They're sort of got very much of a hands-off approach to it. Some have been claiming that they've been more involved than the government is. The government is effectively suggesting that they're not involved as well. The TUC over sort of in autumn, in like August, September, was claiming that the government had said that they weren't involved, but were actually putting some stipulations in the offers to the RMT, which made it less favourable and less likely for the RMT to accept it. So there's some allegations of the government being a little bit underhanded with their approach to these negotiations. But in essence, it looks unlikely that either group are going to come to an agreement anytime soon, and there's huge strike action throughout this month.
And into next month as well.
Yeah, especially on the rails.
Yeah. I remember doing this podcast must have been a month ago now, and it was when the RMT had suspended upcoming strikes, and I think I said something like, it feels like there's a bit of movement in the right direction, and now it feels like it's gone completely I'll take it back and I'll say it's gone the other way. And I think the rhetoric kind of surrounding the train strike has kind of got worse as we head towards Christmas as well, because obviously everyone wants to, people who are kind of having a go at the RMT will say, you're damaging business, you're damaging families' plans, whatever at this time. So this time of year seems particularly kind of tense between the parties, really. I
do also, just before we move on from this, I think it's worth saying as well, going back to the Royal College of Nursing thing, they obviously have strikes throughout this month, but there is a stipulation in legislation that they have to provide sort of life-preserving and urgent care. So even though they are striking this month in exceptional circumstances, in life-threatening cases, the staff still have to be able to carry out their work. So they are still doing that. Nonetheless, though, there's going to be a lot of lost surgeries, things like that are sort of, especially with the backlog in the NHS. I mean, it's only furthering this backlog, furthering this problem. But for urgent care, that is still taking place.
What's the impact of this on the government? This obviously doesn't look great for them. It's not good that businesses are shutting down. The economic impact isn't great. But is this a real issue for Sunak? Or is this kind of a problem for the country, but less so for the party specifically, do you think?
It's a big issue, Jack. Yeah, for Sunak. It's it's an issue, Jack. I think that Sunak is basically trying to just blame, that he's very much in the Conservative government is trying to blame workers for making these demands and trying to say that it's unreasonable that they're doing all these strikes over Christmas. How awful is this? It's terrible. But they're doing a very hands-off approach. They're not intervening in this. They're not using powers that they have in order to intervene and to try and put these to bed. So they're trying to shift the blame away from them and say that this is very much, they're deciding to strike. They're making your Christmases worse. But obviously, if you look at the surface, if you actually look past the surface, if you actually dig into this a little bit, those striking are striking because they're having to accept less pay next year. And it's a cost of living crisis. It's understandable that workers who are having to accept pay cuts, aren't going to do that rolling over. They're going to try and use powers available to them to try and increase their pay. So the Conservative government's just trying to shift blame on this, I think.
I think it's the nurses' strike in particular is a really difficult one because I don't see, what is the end result? Because, in a normal kind of negotiation situation, maybe they meet in the middle on a pay rise. But the fact that it's got to the point where they are actually striking shows that, they haven't been able to reach anything close to an agreement. And with the nursing profession in particular, it's already massively understaffed. And if they're not willing to give them a pay rise to keep nurses currently in the job from striking, going forward, how are we going to attract enough people to be nurses and work in the healthcare industry? It's quite a dangerous situation, I think, without a real obvious kind of endpoint in sight.
It's also an interesting point that the Conservative government has really tried in the pandemic to act as if they are big, proponents for nurses and doing the whole clap for carers and all this. And then when it comes down to it and they're asking for, 19%, I understand 90% on the surface seems quite high, but the fact that they're not even trying to negotiate with them on this, they're not trying to mediate any dispute on this, they're not willing to sort of it doesn't seem like there's this sense of urgency for the Conservative government to put this to bed. Just to be clear, they're the ones that they have legislative power to resolve some of these disputes and they're not using it.
Sure.
This is a lack of care and attention paid by the government.
with the nursing strike, it is effectively, are they willing to pay more? It's much more complicated with the railway strike because obviously there's lots of private companies involved in Network Rail and stuff, but the nurses' strike is one in particular where it's down to the government to make that decision. And there is a hypothetical that you can imagine where the government do say, okay, we'll pay this amount to nurses and the nurses agree to it. And they say, this is because they've done all this during the pandemic and they deserve it. But then you have police officers and firefighters and teachers and lots of other people in the public sector who then will say, we also worked through the pandemic, so why can't we have it? And I think that's what the government is kind of afraid of.
Yeah, don't want to start a ripple effect. Yeah, you can see that, but equally, as you say, nursing and kind of the NHS is in a difficult spot as is, especially when it comes to hiring, kind of the impacts of Brexit and so on. Yeah, it's a difficulty. I think you're right that he's kind of downplaying it at the moment, and that might be working, the kind of blaming it on workers thing. But if it does have impacts on emergency services, etc., going forward, that's a little bit harder to sell.
And when it's a huge number of different industries striking, that argument of these are people just demanding too much kind of falls apart, because if it was just one group, you can kind of put it on them. But when everyone's striking, it's maybe it's something else.
I just want to make a wider point about this as well, which is that with all of this, we basically wasted, and I think I brought this point up before, but we wasted 6 months-ish this year in a really vital point, a really vital turning point for this country. After COVID, in a cost of living crisis, war in Ukraine, Brexit, everything else.
How little time there was properly post-Brexit, pre-COVID.
And I think it's worth noting that it isn't a different party. There might be different factions within the Conservative Party, but when you go to vote, you're voting for Conservatives. These are all the same people. And
a lot of the cabinet members are the same, just moved around
Exactly. And they wasted 6 months, if not more, debating with themselves who should take over, then realising that person's terrible and almost crashed the economy, put pension funds at risk, almost crashed the pound. All of this time, and they had real immediate effects on the economy and the country going forward. But aside from that no one talks about, is the time wasted. Other countries were using that time to try and get their economy stable and back on track. And a lot of these problems, I genuinely believe, come back to this point. The fact that there was no progress made over summer, the fact that they had a really long, protracted leadership election, when they then, in the subsequent leadership election, turned out you could do it in less than 3 days. They had a month over summer where nothing was being done. Johnson refused to legislate, because he said, it's up to the next person, and wasted nearly, 6-8 weeks deciding on who the success would be, who was in office for 49 days, and whose every single one of those policies either turned out to be a failure or were backtracked or were rolled back by her successor, because they had such a divergent opinion on policy. So all of these problems, they are bad, and there's different reasons for them, but it was absolutely not helped by the absolute waste of time we've done this year. And I know that at times we make jokes and we're a bit, we treat some of these issues with a bit of levity, which I think certainly has its place. But there's a real serious point here that the wasted time has had such an effect on politics this year, and there's a lot of people who are being affected and their lives being made significantly worse this Christmas, especially when it comes to things like the nursing strikes, because there's people who are missing vital surgeries and things like that this Christmas, and it sort of at least partly comes back to that.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. That's a fair point.
Another serious issue, one that is another kind of existential ongoing problem for the government, and one that the media isn't ever going to let go of, I suppose. It's an important topic too, is migration. We've obviously seen a lot of talk this week around the numbers of people crossing the channel. So do you want to run through what the latest news is on that, why it's been capturing the media's attention again, why it's an important topic to be discussing again, and also the kind of announcements made by Sunak?
Yeah, so it's a topic that doesn't seem to go away. And as this year has gone on and more people try and cross the channel to get to the UK, it kind of gets more and more media attention because it is record numbers at the moment.
Yeah.
On Tuesday or Wednesday, I think Rishi Sunak made a big announcement, a load of proposals to deal with channel crossings with the goal of, two goals really. One, to try and stop people crossing the channel.
Yeah.
And the second, to clear the backlog of asylum claims that currently exist within the system, which is something like, I think there's 140,000 people in that in the backlog waiting for to hear back for their asylum claim. So he announced a whole load of new things. I'll run through pretty quickly if possible. Firstly, in terms of trying to stop people across the channel, he's promised new legislation to make, this is a quote, to make unambiguously clear that if you enter the UK illegally, you will not be able to remain here. Instead, you will be detained and swiftly returned to your home or to a safe country. So we can look out for some new legislation.
Sure.
He also promised a new unified small boats operational command that will specifically look at kind of intercepting and monitoring the channel crossings. He's going to, I think he wants to double the number of asylum caseworkers to deal with that massive backlog.
Yeah.
He wants to increase raids on illegal working by 50%. He wants to find new places around the country to use as reception centres for migrants and asylum seekers rather than using hotels, which is an ongoing kind of thing people don't like. But then the main thing that he was talking about actually was really quite focused on Albanian migrants, Albanian people crossing the channel into the UK. So some of the announcements relating to that, he wants to change modern slavery laws to significantly raise the threshold of what it is to be considered a modern slave, because a lot of people will, in their asylum claim, that part of their justification for entry is that they are a victim of modern slavery.
Okay.
So he wants to change the threshold for that to make it harder for people to make that claim. He wants a dedicated unit to expedite Albanian asylum claims.
Okay.
He wants, he said, he wants to get to a point where the vast majority of claims from Albania can be deemed unfounded and that people from Albania can be sent home.
Wow.
And he talked about weekly flights until all Albanians in the backlog have been removed. So it's really quite targeted
that really is.
Albanian
What
people.
is the focus on Albania? What's that about?
Yeah, so this year in particular, the number of the proportion of people from Albania crossing the channel into the UK has risen. It's still still lots of people from Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, but the number of people from Albania has risen, and the government have really latched onto that. Partly, I don't know whether the government did it first or the media did it first, but it's kind of intertwined, I suppose, because the government say Albania is a safe country. There's no reason why people should come from Albania to the UK and claim asylum. That's the government's take on it. So they really want to, firstly, stop Albanians coming and claiming asylum in the UK, and for Albanians currently in the system in the UK to be sent home. Another thing I didn't mention, they've got a new agreement with Albania to put border force officials at the airport in Albania to try and stop people smuggling and human trafficking, that type of thing.
Wow.
But it was quite, there's been a lot of rhetoric, especially from Suella Braverman recently, about Albanians, but we haven't really heard so much of it from Rishi Sunak. But that statement he made to the House of Commons was really, really quite targeted on Albanian people in quite a surprising way. But it doesn't feel that many months since there were debates in the House of Commons when it was Boris Johnson and Priti Patel saying their legislation, this is going to crack down on channel crossings. This is the solution. And we're back here again.
Sure.
And they're promising new laws to do exactly the same thing.
So if the government are promising new solutions for the same problem, obviously the opposition benches didn't like the old solutions. They would have deemed them to be a failure. What's their take on these newer solutions?
I mean, Keir Starmer said himself, he said, we've heard all this before. You're saying word for word the same thing as a few months ago.
Yeah.
He recognises that there is an issue that needs solving,
Yeah.
and that is that people are making dangerous crossings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we just saw this week that I think at least 4 people have lost their lives in one crossing a few days ago. But he says what the government have given us are, unworkable gimmicks. That's the exact phrase he used. And he says the system is bad for refugees and bad for taxpayers. So he's kind of towing the line between saying, it's inhumane for the people trying to come here, and it's, expensive and inefficient for people paying taxes.
I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that Sunak is really trying to play to his base, and he's worried about the emergence of like a Nigel Farage party. Yeah. And like, you can have your own views on the asylum system in this country, but ultimately the laws are that if you come to this country and you have a reasonable claim for asylum, the way that you enter the country, you can't be prosecuted for that. You're even though it's technically illegal to do so, that is
your
waived.
reason for doing it.
And this is why a lot of people cross the channel, because they do have a legitimate claim to asylum, and there's no, unless you're Ukrainian, I think there's an Afghanistan scheme as well, Syrian as well. Unless you're from one of those 3 countries, there's no way to claim asylum in this country without somehow getting to this country first. So, but Sunak doesn't want to talk about that.
No.
He won't. He comes up with these these gimmicks to try and appease a base without actually looking at the broader problem, which is that the only way that you can actually make these claims, even if you have a legitimate claim,
is if you're on UK soil.
Somehow get onto UK soil. And how do people get to UK soil? It's in these horrible, dangerous dinghies.
Suella Braverman had that embarrassing moment not too long ago in a select committee hearing where she was asked, how can someone from all these countries make it to the UK and make an asylum claim? And she said, well, they've got to take a safe and legal route, but there are none for those people. Which is the fundamental problem that the government isn't addressing. And loads of charities that work with refugees and asylum seekers, they have lots of different ideas on how to deal with things, but they all agree on the fact that safe and legal routes are needed. And if the government aren't going to address that, then this problem of people crossing the channel is just going to keep going.
It's remarkable how easily they're swayed and how easily they'll institute these things when there is a big news story, like with Ukraine. I mean, it's completely right that we have the Ukraine. I understand why the Ukraine scheme exists, but there's a lot of other problems in other countries. We've done videos on Tigray, for example, in Ethiopia. There's no scheme to come here from Ethiopia if you've got if you've got human rights abuses, if you have a legitimate claim for asylum. But they're more than happy to institute safe and legal routes, provided it's in the news. But unfortunately, Ethiopia hasn't caught the attention of the mass media, and therefore they don't get a scheme to come here.
Well, it sounds like a
messy situation.
Real Rishi.
It's a big issue, Jack. It's a big issue.
Okay, we'll see how that goes down over the next couple of weeks with both his own side and also opposition, what the kind of feedback is. It'll be interesting if any of these new so-called gimmicks work any more successfully than empty flights
I'm going to suggest they might not.
But we might be back in 6 months' time when they've promised new legislation on top of the new legislation to really crack down on it this time.
We can't do it again. Thank you both for joining me.
You're welcome.
Been interesting. Oh, it's unusual to get a response. I like that.
You're welcome, Jack.
Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
How do I respond to that? We'll see.
By telling them who produced this podcast, Jack.
This was The Big Issue, which is hosted by me, Jack Kelly, as well as Ben Blissett and Rory Taylor. It was produced by Scarlett Watchorn and also edited, probably by Scarlett Watchorn. It was a TLDR News production for 326 Limited. Goodbye. Congrats, Rishi.
Very good.
Absolutely smashing it, mate.
Sorry, I feel like I got serious from it.
You did.
Yeah.